I thought everything would feel strange when she came back to this house, the house that hadn't been hers for nearly a year. I expected there to be distance, a touch of awkwardness or hesitation, but there wasn't. The moment she stepped through the door, with that same familiar smile, the same rhythm in her walk, the way she kicked off her shoes and tossed her bag onto the sofa like nothing had changed, I knew that time between us had never really passed. She hugged me, still warm with sunshine, sunscreen, and that old perfume that always made me laugh whenever I walked past her room. "Oh God, I miss you so much," she whispered into my ear, her hands gently holding my face. We opened a bottle of wine before she even touched her suitcase. Then Michael, my husband, walked into the living room, half polite, half curious. He'd heard so many stories about her, about the way she lived, her charming chaos, but I knew he'd never quite imagined her here, in this space, in his home, next to me, like everything could shift in the blink of an eye. And it would. Everything was about to change. We just didn't realize it yet. It didn't take long for her to fill every space in the house, not with things, but with her presence. After a simple but cozy dinner, she insisted on doing the dishes, joking that since I cooked, I deserved the night off. "Does he usually get nights off, or does he do all the work too?" she said, glancing over at Michael with a teasing tone, sponge still in hand, eyes sparkling with something that wasn't entirely a joke. Michael chuckled a bit awkwardly. I laughed louder than necessary, but something inside me tightened. Something vague, something I couldn't quite name. After dinner, I handed her one of my soft robes, the kind I only wear on quiet, restful weekends. She slipped it on immediately, standing there in the doorway, hair still damp, skin fresh with the scent of soap. When she walked back into the living room, I saw Michael look. He didn't blink. He didn't hide it. I said nothing, neither did he. But I saw it. All those little things. The glance that lingered just a bit too long, the comments that hovered between playful and pointed, the gestures that weren't entirely accidental. They wove themselves into the space between the three of us, light as silk, but not so easy to untangle. I didn't know what was beginning to form, only that this wasn't just a homecoming anymore. It was the arrival of a possibility none of us had ever dared to imagine. When she jokingly suggested the three of us sleep together, like we used to when we were single, half serious, half playful, I laughed, Michael laughed too, and I said, sure, partly because of the wine, partly because I didn't think too deeply about it at the time. We turned off the lights and lay there in silence. I lay on my side, facing the wall, arms wrapped around myself beneath the blanket. Behind me were two patterns of breath, one from the man I married, the other from the woman I once considered part of my family. No one said a word, but it was the silence that made everything feel almost unbearably clear. I didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. I could feel it, the air thickening, the warmth behind me subtly shifting. She moved. Slowly, carefully, as if every motion had been weighed before it was made. The blanket shifted just slightly, but enough for me to know contact had been made, intentional and unresisted. Then I heard him exhale, softly, almost surprised, a kind of breath I'd never heard from him before, not out of exhaustion, but surrender. My heart pounded in my chest. Still, I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I knew. But then something changed. Not from her, but from him. A small movement, almost imperceptible, as if he were reaching for me. And then, beneath the covers, his hand brushed against mine. And he didn't grab it, just touched. Just enough for me to know he was choosing me. In that darkness, between the three of us, I understood something I'd never considered before. I wasn't a bystander. I wasn't on the outside. I was part of whatever this was. And that silence, that thick, charged silence between the three of us, it wasn't resistance. It was an invitation. I'm not sure who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was her, the one who, from beginning to end, had always been the quiet breeze that pulled everything gently toward her, never rushing, never forcing. But one thing I do know for sure, when I turned around, no one pulled away. There was no panic, No shock. Just a dense stillness between the three of us, where glances lingered longer than usual and breathing grew deeper, slower, like we were all stepping across an invisible threshold. I remember the first touch clearly. It wasn't from him and it wasn't from her. It was from me. A single finger brushed against the inside of her wrist, slowly, as if I were testing my own emotions. She didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting mine, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with a strange and quiet gentleness. Then came him, his hand still holding mine, but now with a softer squeeze. A subtle reassurance that he was still there, still with me, even as her presence filled the room. No one spoke. There was no need. She lay down closer, the curve of her body pressing gently against his back, but her eyes stayed on me. I shifted forward, touching him, not to claim him, but to join, to stop standing on the outside. 3 breaths, falling into sync. 3 people, 1 bed. No clear boundaries. No one leading. Just a quiet, unspoken understanding that this was where we were and no one was alone. I thought I would feel suffocated, ashamed, lost, but all I felt was a strange kind of peace. As if after all these years, I had finally been invited back into my own life, not through duty, but through something real. And that was something I had never truly known until now. Amid the soft breaths and slow shifts on the plush mattress, I realized something. None of us was trying to pull away. No one was startled, and no one was pretending this wasn't happening. The touch of a hand, the exchange of glances, the synchronized breathing, each was a quiet way of saying, I see you. And in that silence, for the first time in a very long while, I felt truly present. I used to think that the feeling of belonging only came through defined relationships, husband and wife, best friends, family. But lying between these 2 people, one a part of my past, the other my present, I came to understand connection doesn't always require a title. Sometimes it only needs a matched breath, a touch that needs no explanation, a moment held without being pushed away. And I didn't feel guilty. And that scared me, not because I didn't understand boundaries, but because I realized I had spent so much of my life in a confined space where every emotion had to be shaped to fit a role. Wife, friend, the one who keeps the household steady. But here in this moment, I was just me. No masks, no pressure. And both of them, in their own way, saw me in a way Michael never had before. I don't know where this will lead. Maybe to distance, maybe to another transformation. But one thing I know for sure, I don't want to live a life where I have to shrink myself to fit inside it. If someone asked me what moment made me feel seen, I wouldn't say it was the wedding or some luxurious vacation. It was in the quiet, in the dark, between 2 people when I reached out my hand and no one let it go unanswered. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains like a gentle but undeniable reminder everything had changed. I lay there, between them, our breaths overlapping in a space thick with things left unsaid. When I shifted slightly, Zach turned away and she, already awake, glanced at me for a second, saying nothing. She didn't need to. None of us did. We all knew that moment had changed everything. And just like that, the familiar feeling returned. Me, once again, feeling like a stranger in my own space. The entire day, I moved through the house like an uninvited guest. Every room, every object seemed to echo the questions I hadn't yet found the courage to answer. Do I love Michael? Do I truly feel loved? And if not, then what I found that night, was it love or just an escape from loneliness? I didn't blame Zach, and I didn't blame her. I blamed myself for letting the silence go on too long, for letting the hollow space inside me grow so wide that any hint of closeness could slip in and feel like salvation. But now I understood connection can't replace a broken foundation. It only covers it up. And when the curtain finally falls, I'm still left facing the truth. I no longer know who I am in this marriage. I sat at the dining table, staring at Michael's morning coffee cup. The image of him on our wedding day, so gentle. The afternoons he fixed the window latch just because he knew I liked to sit there and read. None of it was fake. But maybe somewhere along the way, he and I stopped meeting where it mattered most, the heart. I know now that I need time, not to choose between two people, but to find myself again. Because if I don't know what I truly need, then any choice, no matter how right it seems, will only lead me further from home. I spent the entire afternoon in the backyard, the place that used to be my sanctuary before everything became so tangled. Zach didn't say much anymore. He quietly avoided eye contact every time we crossed paths. She had started packing her things, saying she didn't want to overstay. But I knew the truth. All of us were pulling back, waiting to see which direction I would choose to move. Michael got home late that evening. He set his briefcase down and looked at me for a long moment, as if he wanted to ask something but didn't know how to begin. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and tired. I nodded, though inside, everything was coming undone. That tenderness, why did it hurt so much? Later that night, after a nearly silent dinner, I walked into the living room where Zach was waiting. I sat across from him, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. "Zach," I began, "what happened between us? It wasn't a misunderstanding. I know that. But if we keep letting our feelings lead the way, then maybe we'll end up losing ourselves." He looked at me, his eyes full of pain, but also understanding. "You're choosing my dad," he said, without resentment. "No," I shook my head. "I'm choosing me. I'm choosing clarity. And that starts with not hiding anymore, not sneaking around, not hurting anyone else." I stood and walked back to the bedroom, where Michael was sitting holding the cup of tea he had made for us both. I sat down beside him and for the first time in a long time reached out and took his hand. "Michael," I whispered, "I want us to be honest about the distance, about the things I've let slip away, and about the things I need you to hear." He didn't respond right away, but he gently squeezed my hand. And in that moment, I knew what I had just chosen wasn't a person. It was myself. It was the courage to begin again, no matter with whom, no matter where. That choice alone was worth everything. I never expected that confessing everything to Michael would bring such a sense of relief. Though I didn't go into every detail, I told him about the inner conflict, the moments of weakness, and the closeness with Zach that had crossed the line. He sat silently through it all. No interruptions, no outbursts, just a deep sadness on his face, the kind that belongs to someone who's just realized they've been missing something important for far too long. "I should have seen it sooner," Michael said at last. "I thought that providing for you, making sure everything was taken care of, was enough to make you stay." His voice wasn't angry, just low, steady, and heavy, like he was trying to make sense of it all, too. I looked at him, the man I once loved, once chose, and in his eyes, I saw something real, an effort, however quiet, to save what remained between us. The next day, Zach moved out on his own. No harsh words, no pleading. He just left behind a short note. "I understand why you made the choice you did, and no matter what, thank you for not denying what we felt." I read it in silence, eyes welling with tears. I hadn't just lost a companion or a friend. I had let go of a depth of emotion I never imagined I'd feel. Michael and I didn't fall right back into place. There were long silences, nights when he slept facing away, and I didn't force myself to pull him close. But something was different. For the first time in years, we began asking each other real questions. "How are you feeling today? Are you tired? Is there something we could do differently?" Even just a little. And in that honesty, something shifted permanently. Not to erase the past, but to step forward into a more honest present with ourselves and with each other. Zach wasn't the wedge between us. He became the mirror that forced us to look back clearly, truthfully, and with more courage than we'd ever had before. Zach left on a cloudy morning. I stood by the window, watching his car roll slowly down the quiet street, disappearing behind a line of trees. There were no tears, no goodbye hug, just one long look straight into my eyes. A look that held everything that had happened, everything left unsaid, and everything that would never be put into words. Since that day, Michael began waking up earlier. He made coffee for both of us. He didn't say much, but the way he placed the mug in front of me each morning felt different. He wasn't just being a responsible husband anymore. He was learning how to be present. We started taking walks together on the weekends. Once at the market, he reached for my hand. A small gesture, one I hadn't felt from him in so long. And in that moment, my heart stirred, not because of something new, but because something old had quietly returned. Still, the silences remained. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering Zach's eyes, his voice, the feeling of his hand in mine, so vivid it made me turn toward Michael, just to remind myself I was here, with the man I once chose. But the emptiness crept in anyway. Not because I still loved Zach, but because I had allowed myself to touch a part of my emotions I'd never known before, and now I had to learn how to let it go. Michael knew. He never asked, but he knew. And I knew he was also wrestling with a kind of fracture inside himself. Not because I had betrayed him, but because he once believed he was enough. Now he understood being enough isn't about giving everything. It's about knowing when to stop and truly listen. We're not back to how we were. Maybe we never will be. But every day we choose each other again, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet belief that after everything, real love sometimes means learning how to forgive, both the other person and yourself. Time moved slowly, as if the crack between Michael and me couldn't be filled with a single apology or a late-night embrace. But then, one afternoon in mid-month, as the last light of day streamed through the kitchen window, Michael walked in while I was chopping onions and asked, "Can you teach me how to make that soup you cooked the other day?" I almost laughed, not at the question itself, but because for the first time in so long, he wasn't afraid to step into something small and intimate. We stood side by side in the little kitchen, not saying much, just chopping vegetables, seasoning broth, and watching the steam rise from the pot. No grand gestures, just two people trying to find their way back to a rhythm that once felt familiar. I didn't bring up Zach. Michael didn't ask. But there was an unspoken understanding between us. What happened couldn't be erased, but it didn't need to be relived. Some things don't require words because the heart already knows. Michael started inviting me to movies again, to quiet evening walks when the wind had settled. And I realized he was learning how to love me again. Not the wife he'd grown used to, but the woman standing in front of him now. Complex, scarred, once lost, but trying to find her way back. One night at the theater, he reached over and gently touched my hand. He leaned in and whispered, "I don't know if things will ever be the same again, but I still want to learn how to stay." I turned to him in the dark and simply nodded. Love, I've come to learn, isn't always overwhelming emotion or grand promises. Sometimes it's sitting next to each other in silence, sharing a simple dinner and agreeing that some days will be hard, but choosing to hold each other's hand anyway. And for me, that's enough. One morning, as I stood pouring coffee and gazing out the misted window, I suddenly realized I was breathing more easily. Not because everything had been perfectly resolved, but because I had stopped running from my own feelings. The days spent tangled in inner conflict, in unspoken truths and avoided glances had slowly given way to a quieter, more honest rhythm of life. Michael and I didn't go back to how we were. There's no such thing as how it was when hearts have changed. But we learned to see each other through new eyes, the eyes of two people who had once lost one another in silence and were now choosing to stay. He knew I had lost my way. I knew he had let me slip through the cracks of a busy life. But we both understood this: love isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to turn back when it would have been easier to walk away. I no longer blame Zach, and I don't resent myself for moments of weakness. What happened? I don't deny, but I've learned to lay it down, not to forget, but to feel light again. I forgave Michael for the years I felt invisible beside him. And I forgave myself, the woman who once ached to be seen, to touch, something that made her heart beat again, even if only for a moment. Now, each morning, I make coffee for two, not out of duty or submission, but as a quiet gesture from someone who's learned to love again. With sincerity, without expectation, I choose to stay not out of responsibility, but because for the first time in years, I feel brave enough to rebuild from the ruins with the man who once hurt me and with the version of myself I had nearly forgotten. Maybe what haunts us most isn't the wrong choices we make, but the things we stay silent about for too long. Elena wasn't perfect. She loved, she stumbled, she doubted herself, but through it all, she found the courage to face the truth, to learn forgiveness, and most importantly, to listen to the voice within her. This story isn't meant to glorify mistakes or romanticize a fractured marriage. It's a gentle reminder that all of us can lose our way. But if there's still honesty, if there's still heart, then love, even worn and scarred, can be rebuilt from the ground up. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever stood on the edge between reason and emotion, I hope this story reminds you that you're not alone. Just share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to forgive someone? Do you believe a marriage can heal after deep wounds? And if you see parts of yourself in quiet stories like this, stories that don't shout but go straight to the soul, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll meet again in another story, another hard take, but still you, still me, quietly listening and healing.